Now let's move on to the second of the validity rules, the rule that has to do with negation. Let's start by just reviewing what this rule is. If a syllogism includes negations, it must have exactly one negative premise and a negative conclusion. Okay, a couple of things to notice about this rule. Syllogisms don't have to have negatives. Think about AAA1. Those are all affirmative propositions, so there are no negatives at all. So, in a sense, this if means that we'll have a trigger for a rule. And the trigger is that a syllogism includes any negatives at all. So that's the whole idea. If a syllogism includes any negations at all, then it must have these two characteristics: exactly one negative premise, no more, no less, and a negative conclusion. All right, now let's look at some examples of this. Start right here. This is a great example of a syllogism that follows the rule. So have a look at it. No P is M, all S is M, no S is P. So ask yourself, does this syllogism have negatives? Yes, it has negatives. Since it has negatives, it has to follow the pattern. Does it have exactly one negative premise? Yes. The major premise is negative. The minor premise is affirmative. Does it have a negative conclusion? Yes. The negative conclusion, no S is P, satisfies that second condition. So this argument form, which incidentally is EAE2, right? EAE2 follows the rule exactly. It has one negative premise, the other is affirmative. These could be in any order, doesn't matter. One negative premise and a negative conclusion. Now let's look at some of the ways that an argument could fail to follow this rule. So let's look at this one. No P is M, some S is not M, therefore some S is not P. So ask yourself, are there negatives? Yes, there are negations in this sentence. In this syllogism. But the problem is, instead of exactly one negative premise, we have both premises are negative, and the conclusion is negative. So the conclusion, in a sense, meets the condition, but we have a problem with the premises because we don't have exactly one negative premise. All right, let's look at this second example. All M is P, some S is M, therefore some S is not P. Again, we do have negations involved in this syllogism, but the problem is we don't have exactly one negative premise, and this time it's not because they're both negative, that's the exactly one part of that rule, but it's because none are negative. See, these are both affirmative propositions, so we meet the condition, the second condition, a negative conclusion, but it breaks the rule because there's not exactly one negative premise. All right, now let's look at this last example. Some P is not M, all S is M, therefore some S is P. Again, does it trigger the rule? Yes, there are negations in this syllogism. Does it have exactly one negative premise? Yes, the major premise is negative. The minor in this case is affirmative. But does it have a negative conclusion? No, the conclusion is not negative. So it violates the rule, this time by not having a negative conclusion. Now let's look for some patterns in the ways that syllogisms might break this rule, because it's those patterns that will be named fallacies. So let's open this and let's look at the three ways that it's possible to break the negation rule. Okay, first, you could have too many negative premises. So remember, the rule is exactly one negative premise. If you have too many, in other words, if they're both negative, then you have what we will call the fallacy of exclusive premises. So that's the first pattern. The second pattern is, what if you have one negative premise So in other words, it satisfies the first condition, but you have an affirmative conclusion. All right, that's another pattern. In that case, you have the fallacy of drawing an affirmative conclusion from a negative premise. That's actually the official name of the fallacy. In practice, though, we shorten it down and we often call it the fallacy of affirmative conclusion. But always remember what we mean by that is the fallacy of drawing an affirmative conclusion from a negative premise, because if you didn't have a negative premise, the rule wouldn't kick in and we wouldn't have a problem, right? All right, and the third way you could break this rule is you could have a negative conclusion, but you could have it without one negative premise. And this is named the fallacy of drawing a negative conclusion from affirmative premises. And again, we often shorten that down to the fallacy of negative conclusion, but always remember that that's shorthand for the fallacy of drawing a negative conclusion from affirmative premises. This is different than the pattern number one, because pattern number one is having too many negative premises. That has its own name. Pattern number three is having affirmative premises. In other words, it violates the exactly one negative premise rule by having affirmative premises, but it does so with a negative conclusion. All right, now let's look at some actual examples and we'll talk through these. All right, so consider this first example. Some M is P, no S is M, therefore some S is P. First of all, does it trigger the rule? What triggers the rule is when a syllogism has a negation. And yes, it does. The minor premise is a negation. And so, for number one, we will have to look at whether it meets the pattern in other ways. So the minor premise is a negation, so it meets the exactly one negative premise condition, but the conclusion, some S is P, is not a negation, so it violates the rule. So what fallacy would it be? This is the fallacy of drawing an affirmative conclusion from a negative premise. All right, so just to talk you through that, remember, exactly one negative premise, yes, it has exactly one, the minor, but it does not have a negative conclusion, so this is the fallacy of affirmative conclusion. All right, now let's look at number two. In number two, we have all M is P, all M is S, therefore no S is P. Does it trigger the rule? Yes. It triggers the rule in that it has a negative as the conclusion, but look at the two premises. Both premises are affirmative, so this violates the rule by having no negative premises with a negative conclusion, which is named what? The fallacy of negative conclusion. So now let's look at number three. Some P is not M, some S is not M, therefore some S is P. Does it have negatives? Yes, so it triggers this negation rule. Look at condition number one. Does it have exactly one negative premise? No. But how does it break that rule? It breaks the rule by having too many. So it has two negative premises, and we have a name for that. It's the fallacy of exclusive premises. Notice, if you have exclusive premises, in other words, if you have too many negative premises, it doesn't matter what the conclusion is. The conclusion could be affirmative or negative, because the point is you've broken that first condition by having too many, not too few plus a negative conclusion. Now let's look at number four. Some P is not M, all M is S, therefore some S is not P. Do we have negations? Yes, it triggers the rule. Do we have exactly one negative premise? Yes, it's the major. Do we have a negative conclusion? Yes, some S is not P. So number four actually passes this rule. Now remember, to be valid, it has to pass all the rules on the Boolean interpretation. To be valid on the Aristotelian interpretation, it has to pass this rule, the negation rule, and also the distribution rule, which we will cover next. So number four is a candidate for a valid argument because it hasn't broken a rule so far. Now, the negation rule can easily be applied to moods and figures if you just consider what the mood actually means. It tells you right on the surface which propositions are negatives and which are affirmatives, right? So if you look at example number 5, EAO3, we don't even have to worry about the figure because we can tell that we have exactly one negative premise and a negative conclusion. So this, superficially at least, this passes the negation rule, so superficially it's a candidate for validity. We would have to look a little deeper, right? Now look at number 6. In number 6, we have exactly one negative premise, but we have an affirmative conclusion. So number 6 is the fallacy of affirmative conclusion. That is the fallacy of drawing an affirmative conclusion from a negative premise. Number 7, AIE4, we can skip thinking about the figure and just look at the mood. In this mood, we have two affirmative premises and a negative conclusion. So this is the fallacy of drawing a negative conclusion from affirmative premises, or the fallacy of negative conclusion for short. Now look at number 8, O001. So let's just focus on the O0O mood. Notice we have negative major, negative minor, and a negative conclusion. So it breaks this rule. It breaks the first condition, exactly one negative premise, but it breaks it by having too many. So number 8 is the fallacy of exclusive premises.